So I am thrilled today to introduce our speaker and my colleague, the housing technician at the center, Ben Iluzada. He should be up at the top of your screen. Hi, Ben.
Hello.
On a daily basis, Ben is responsible for the preservation, quality, matting, and framing of objects for storage and exhibition. And he also designs and constructs sealed microclimate packages. Significantly, Ben is a printmaker, paper maker, and book artist whose work has been collected and exhibited internationally. He is amazingly the artist also of several of the prints that you received in your packet. Outside of his personal artistic practice, Ben focuses on printing for other artists too, through his own small collaborative edition studio and through larger institutions. He received his MFA in book arts and printmaking from the University of the Arts and a BFA in printmaking from the Maryland Institute College of Art. Ben, we look forward to learning from you today, and I am going to now mute myself and pay exclusive attention to the chat box so that you can lead the session.
All righty, thank you, Stephanie. So once again, hello everyone and welcome to today's workshop and webinar, The Identification and Preservation of Prints. This program is provided with the generous support of the William Penn Foundation and additional support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts, and the Independence Foundation. This one, come on. So a little bit before we begin, the Conservation Center for Art and Historical Artifacts was founded in 1977 by Marilyn Weidner here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. CCAHA is a one-stop shop for all your conservation and preservation needs, offering conservation treatment, surveys and consultation, digitization and reproduction, housing and framing, funding assistance, packing and shipping, emergency planning and response preparations, preservation planning, and project management. And as Stephanie said, I am the housing technician and a printmaker, which has his own shop here in the studio. So let us begin. The first things first is we need to define what a print is. There are two major definitions for what a print can be. The traditional definition, which we're going to use today, is a transferred image, usually a medium or a pigment supported, suspended in a medium of some sort, and on a support like parchment, paper, or fabric. That is what we're going to mostly be using throughout the workshop, but I wanted to bring your attention that there is a contemporary idea of what that means. And some parts of the printmaking process can be, oh, sorry, I can't be heard very well. Some parts of it are that contemporary prints can be anything that's reproducible or made mechanically. So some people might consider 3D printing as a traditional printmaking method, or something like bronze sculpting or bronze founding or iron casting. Since things that can be reproduced and remade, those can be considered prints. We're not going to talk about that as much because that's a bit broader of a conversation to have about what can be a print. And we're primarily going to be focusing on what a print is on the traditional sense. So we're going to be focusing on the major printmaking processes that you can find today. And those are relief, intaglio, lithography, and silkscreen. I'm also going to be talking briefly about digital printing because that is a very large aspect that you see in archives today. I wanted to note that we are not going to be talking about photographs. Photographs are their very own kind of deal, and I am not as familiar with them. So relief printing kind of started, we believe, before or around 200 AD. It's the oldest process which we've kind of been there. It's been something that's been done as woodcuts or cylinder impressions in wax. We have extant surviving fabric samples of fabric printing, which go back to at least 200 that come from China. And then as that kind of went on, we have the oldest books that were kind of created by woodcut block printing, which, oops, someone came in, which is, we have at least from about 868 AD. So we know that they're at least before that. Letterpress was invented in Asia as movable ceramic type in 1040 AD to 1300. Different innovations between the way for ceramic to wood and then metal. And then it was created in Europe in the 1440s to 50s by Gutenberg, as many people probably already know. The next major innovation in relief printing was wood engraving in around the 1770s. And then linocut came around with the advent of linoleum flooring that you find in a lot of ships. And then the next major innovation was photopolymer plates in photography, which happened in around the 1950s with the advent of computers and the first kinds of digital typing and letter setting. Of course, there are other advances along the way, but in my opinion, these are the largest innovations in just relief printing specifically. And we're going to start off with a little video. Come on, now play. This is soundless, so don't worry about it. Please read along. I don't think my voice is great for that kind of stuff on this narration. So yeah, different materials will dictate different carving methods. So here we have U gouges and V gouges, carving away a soft linoleum. We carve away what you don't want to have printing, and what will remain is what's going to print. If my sound is fuzzy, please let me know, and I'll keep trying to get this fixed for a moment. Is this any better, anyone? Yeah. So after carving, you get to print it, and that involves a bunch of oil-based inks, mostly, which is kind of like an oil paint. Alrighty, so I hope everyone was able to follow along with that. We're going to move on to the next one. We're going to talk a bit more about that process. So as you saw in the video, relief uses a matrix, or like a wood block or a lino block, where ink is applied onto positive areas. All forms of relief printing will have something called squeeze, which is where the ink at the edges of the surface will squeeze out from the block onto the paper. You can see that under magnification on the left, where it looks a bit thicker or denser on the sides and a little bit thinner on the center section, because the surface, those edges will collect a little bit more ink. Another key characteristic of relief printing is that ink will appear lowered or impressed into the surface of the sheet of paper, which is a result of the matrix being pressed into the sheet of paper while it's being printed to the press or by hand. Also, you can get these really graphic black lines like you see on the left that are made by cutting away on either side. Oh, come on. So the first of them we're going to talk about is woodcuts. Woodcuts are the earliest form of relief printing and are characterized mostly by the wood grain that appears in the printed surface. It's also really well known for very strong and graphic quality. Here's two examples of one of the carved blocks. You can see where all of the negative space is carved away, and also the print that Allison saw where you have that wood grain that's very immersed in the printed texture of the surface. Something else that you'll also see characteristic of relief prints is this thing called chatter, which if you look in, I think I can do a little, nope, not that one, wrong button. If you see like here, these kinds of marks, that is called chatter, where those carving parts, the parts of the wood which weren't fully carved away, get transferred through the ink onto the finished color. Next we're going to have is lino cuts, which are very similar to woodcuts. The only difference is that instead of using a piece of wood, you're using a sheet of linoleum, which is a very smooth and easy to carve substance. It also doesn't have any grain, so you won't get that wood-looking texture on your prints. And so that's something that people tend to like. You also find it when people want to do very large work because it's very affordable. And you don't have to spend as much effort getting larger sheets of it as you would a large sheet of wood. It's also much easier to carve. Oh, hey there, something just gave me a note. There we go. Sorry. So curves are much easier to carve with linoleum because there isn't any grain in the wood. So lino cuts are characterized by having a lot of curvature or round parts of it. Not saying that woodcuts can't have that, just saying that lino cuts are much more easily done with that kind of thing. Also, one thing with lino cuts is you can mount them onto various supports and print them at various type sizes. So you can print them on a letterpress machine if you want to, or do it by hand. And here are two exemplary ways to look at this. Lino cut on the left and a woodcut on the right. Lino cuts are very smooth, graphic, and are great for those nice wilting curves you might see in a plant, whereas woodcuts are very angular and they have a really nice textural difference that they have. And I would be remiss not to talk about like Asian and Eastern kinds of prints. Japanese and Asian styles of printmaking are very similar to Western, but they have a very large stylistic difference. When Western prints are more graphic and bold, Eastern, and at least in this case, Japanese prints are very, very subtle, made mostly of washes of color and building up layers and patterns. Also, you'll see that many Eastern prints will have text as an integral part of the image. So you might have things in a cartouche, like you see the inclusion of text that's separated on the left. You'll also have a lot of chops or marks for seals from the printers, publishers, censors. A lot of that gets placed onto the final print in Japanese and other Asian prints. So that's one way of identifying it. If you see a bunch of seals or little circular things on the left or right-hand sides of the print, I'll let you know that that's probably from the East. The next big printmaking or relief process is wood engraving, which is using the end grain of hard wood blocks that have been glued or seamed together. An artist is able to get very intricate and very detailed carving marks that'll hold up for extended use. You see this a lot in things like illustration. So it was kind of like the major way that you printed illustrations in books and so forth on the letterpress machine, was to have these very, very dense, very slightly small sometimes, very delicate, detailed images that could stand up to a lot of use. And speaking of letterpress, you have the next major section and the next real big invention that kind of characterizes all of printing, because letterpress printing was one of the major things that started the printing revolution in the 1400s. So as previously mentioned, it was invented in the 1440s and 50s by Johannes Gutenberg in the West, and it has really three major periods of use that you see. You have its introduction and its initial just full crash course and run for about 500 years, from about 1450 to around the mid-1950s or mid-century, where it was replaced by flexography and eventually offset printing. During the Industrial Revolution, so you have the craft revival in the 1880s through early 1900s, which was a rejection of the Industrial Revolution, where people wanted to focus again on the craft of objects instead of just the quantity. So people were looking more for the quality, and they were really focusing on that for those small 20, 30 years in that period. And then lastly, you have the fine press letterpress revival of the 1980s to today. And that really brought letterpress printing back into the forefront as an art form. It was kind of came around after the advent of offset lithography, where they kind of phased out all of letterpress throughout any large commercial sector, and artists and artist book publishers wanted to really return to the craft of something, similarly to how they did in the 1880s. Letterpress broadsides are another really, really common thing that you'll encounter in archives, as well as just in general. A broadside is a term that refers to any single sheet print, from a folio that is pasted around your town to inserts in your newspaper. They still generally have the characteristic mark of relief printing, so slightly sunken ink into the surface. And it's also noticeable that since a lot of the broadsides have text, you can see damages in text and in letter forms. This is true of all letterpress, but broadsides, which have a much larger text and fonts usually, it's more noticeable. There's an example from Amos Kennedy where the I and the A and the L in this poster on the left all have damages just because they've been repeatedly used over and over again. And so, print ID time. So of the print packet I sent out to everyone, there are several prints here that you might notice have some of those characteristics. Hopefully I should be able to get everyone to be unmuted. One second. How do I get everyone unmuted? I don't see how I can do that. I don't know if Stephanie or Alana can help with that, but everyone, can you look around the prints that I sent out to you? What ones seem like they might have a textured surface? Like a wood texture surface.
Those who don't feel shy can go ahead and unmute themselves if they'd like to answer.
Yeah.
The beaver print.
People have it. You also,
Print.
if you turn your cameras on, I can see which ones you hold up. Yeah, I see two of you have it at least. Yep, the otter. This guy. Wait, where am I in this video thing? Please, let me see myself. There we go. Yeah, the otter. That is a woodcut. I have the actual block for him somewhere over here. I'll find him later. What about the one that might have like a large speckled surface? Or very smooth, curvy lines? I see one person has it. Yes. Some people have it. It is this one. The lino cuts, these are lino cuts. You can tell they are because they have the speckling on the interior. If you use your loop, you can look at them a little bit closer and you'll see that it's got some speckling to it. And you'll see that it's got from the back, if you kind of look at it under a light, you'll see that there's a bit of the light will hit it and make an impression. So you can see that it's been impressed into the sheet of paper. Both the front and the back really, but the back is the easiest way to look at it. And to see that kind of a texture difference. And the next one we're going to look at is which one has text that looks like it might have been pressed into the surface of the paper, or the sheet. I know there aren't many that have text, but at least one. So I see one person has it so far. This one is the one that has the letterpress, actually. You'll notice that when you look at the text under a loop, little loop, that the ink kind of has that squish out from the side, and it also is slightly into the paper. We'll get to this one later. Keep it around. Another thing to note with this, the help wanted one, for people that look at it, there are a lot of prints that you'll find like in older magazines and newspapers that are 1700s, 1600s, around that time frame. They'll involve processes similar to this, where they'll have letterpress text been printed, and then another printed method that we'll talk about soon. Alrighty, moving on. Oops. Intaglio. Okay, move these all to the side. Back to the script. So the next major print process we're going to talk to you guys about is intaglio. And here's a brief timeline of development of that, where you have line engraving and dry point that gets taken from metal engraving and silver smithing and goldsmithing. that goes onto a copper plate. Really kind of becomes a thing that's possible to be done once the printing press and pressure of that kind is really figured out. And then you have dry point as well, which is where you're just taking, we'll get to it soon. Etching and using acids onto the plate is invented in the early 1500s. Much later on, you have mezzotints come around. Aqua tinting is developed in the 1760s and 70s, and that also corresponds with the invention of spit bite and sugar lift and soft ground etching. In the early 1800s, photogravure kind of is invented alongside the other photographic processes like daguerreotypes and daguerreotypes and a lot of those words. So from then on, you get steel facing, which kind of preserves plates, which is invented in around the 1860s. And then in the 1970s, you get photo intaglio and solar plates, which kind of become a big thing. And so we're going to watch a short clip. Once again, it's going to be soundless once it decides to start. Come on. There we go. Please follow along with the text at the bottom of the screen. How do I? Yeah. Alrighty, so intaglio is broken down into several distinct categories: wet and dry, meaning with or without acid, and linear and tonal, which are pretty straightforward in my opinion. Linear dry points engraving means you have lines and you're mostly made of lines, and then tonal are things that are made by using large swaths of tone. As you saw in the video, intaglio uses a dampened sheet of paper that gets pressed into a metal plate or sometimes a plexiglass plate, and ink, which is pushed into the crevices that are formed during the plate making, gets pulled out by the dampened sheet of paper. And so you'll see that the ink kind of sits on top of the paper when you look at it under magnifying glass. So it looks so that under away from the light, it's very noticeable. You can see it stands really proud above the surface of the paper. Now then, so the oldest form of intaglio is engraving, which is taken directly from silver and goldsmiths who engraves arms, armor, and other decorative metals like plates and cups. Pardon. It is characterized by very clean, crisp, and sharp lines that have no burr and no other damage to them. And you can use it to make stippling and cross hatching and a wide array of tonality just from the line. Dry point, on the other hand, is just dragging a piece or a scribe through the metal, and it kicks up a burr. So it's kind of the opposite of engraving, but they still are the two dry processes. So if you see on the left, you can see how the burr is kicked up, and the ink will collect on both the actual line that you made and then the sides of that metal, which got displaced. And then you'll also see when you print it, it has this really fuzzy quality to it. You see here on the right. And here is a difference between, oh, come on. Let me go. There we go. The leaf in engraving, and even intaglio in general, is for woodcuts or for relief prints, you have to carve away what you don't want. So if you want to create cross hatching, you have to carve away little diamonds between something. Whereas for like an engraving or an etching or a dry point, you can just create these smooth gradient lines that will result in the solid cross hatching that you wanted to get. So it looks very nice in that regard. Mesotinting is a process where you create and cover the entire plate of copper with that burr. It's a very labor-intensive process, but it creates these wonderfully very rich, velvety, dark tones over the entire plate in which the lights are then burnished into. You can see an example of someone burnishing a plate back up in the upper right and magnification down in the lower right. Unfortunately, I don't have the tools to create a mesotint, so they don't have any in the packet. Otherwise, it'd be a wonderful sight to see. Come on. Etchings, on the other hand, are where you coat the entire plate in a hard ground or soft ground, and then you open areas away and eat it with acid. So in this plate, you can see that there are clean, rounder lines that are made by the etching process, in contrast with the darker, heavier ones that the dry point lines give to the center section. It also has some other secondary processes like embossing and debossing that you can see here in the plate. So for engraving and etching lines, since they're both lines that are made this process, etching lines, you'll notice, are more characterized by these like breaks in them, kind of. That's what I describe it, like the ink won't always be explicitly 100% there, just because the line is a bit spotty, because it's acid eating away at the metal. Whereas in engraving, the line will be very crisp and smooth because it's just one piece. It's a gouge burin pulling and pushing the metal away. So you can get some very, very, very nice tapering and swells within the engraving, whereas you can't really have that in an etching. Come on. Aqua tinting is the next process we're going to talk about briefly. Oh, my notes went back to the other section. 1 second, wait for 2 minutes. Aqua tint involves coating the plate in countless little acid-resistant drops, which then get eaten around by the acids. It's a very common way to achieve tonality and can be used to create large swaths of tone. Under magnification, it looks like a bunch of little bright islands that are surrounded by black or whatever the printed color is. You can see that in the magnification on the upper right, where it's all those white spots are where the acid resist landed, and everything in around it is what was eaten away by the acids. There's also a little step chart down there on the lower right. You can see how tonally varied aqua tints can get just by how long you leave it in the acid and how much of the actual acid resist you put down on your plate. Sugar lift and spit bites are the two most painterly kinds of printmaking methods you'll find. They're very, very lucky you'll find these for more of the like contemporary and fine art kinds of print processes, and less in like the archives of like, this is information. This is more just like an art for art's sake kind of printmaking method. They both need to have aqua tint put down onto the plate before they can be made. Sugar lift is a method where you apply the hard ground over a water-soluble fluid. That way it can like lift off in water before you etch it. You'll leave painterly brush marks behind. Whereas spit biting is you're painting directly with acid onto the metal plate to create varying densities and varying tones. the next major intaglio process is photogravure and photointaglio. These are the two photographic possible printmaking processes for intaglio. Both of them require photopositive films, and photogravure is where you're using that photopositive emulsion that's on top of a copper plate to etch through the copper plate in that area. Whereas photointaglio is using a small thin metal plate with a very thick layer of photoemulsion that is partially exposed, and you can wash away it in different intensities to create a big chunk of varying height and varying thickness photoemulsion on top of that plate. And they're both printed like an intaglio plate. The three main things to look for when identifying an intaglio print are the plate bevel, which you'll see it's the edge of the plate. Sometimes ink will collect there, but it's something that is created when the plate goes through the press at high pressure. The next thing you should be looking for is the ink quality, the line quality. You can see that it might be very tactile. It feels tactile, it feels thick, there's a texture to it. There's a high chance that the ink or the print is an intaglio print. And then the last thing to look for is something called plate tones. You can see it in this example, like right here, and like over on this side. I think you can see my laser pointer or pen here. You'll see it. Oh, no, go back. Laser pointer, pen. Like this right here. Okay. I will Caroline Ziegler, I'll go back to that in just a moment. But yeah, so this in between these sections, that is plate tone. It's a little bit like a leftover residue of ink that's on the plate itself. And then for photointaglio, just so I can go back to that real quick, like I'm right here. Photointaglio, you can tell it's an intaglio print because it'll have a plate bevel, honestly. That's the biggest way to identify it. It'll have this plate bevel that you see here, or here, I guess is a better way of looking at it. For intaglio, you have to really look for those plate bevels. It might be layers of ink there, some buildup, but that's how you can identify that from something like a lithograph that we'll talk to soon. Okay, next. Come on, let me go. Oof. The next thing I want to talk about is collagraphs. I don't want to spend just a moment on these because they're a very fun hybrid of both relief and intaglio monotype. They're very textural. The characteristics for these are kind of just what you see there. It's usually a bleed print, so it's the entire piece of paper. You'll have debossed and embossed areas. You'll have a combination of intaglio, so intaglio and relief, so carved marks, and then the surface of the plate will be printed. And then usually has a very, very thick application of ink. I think they're a lot of fun, and I love when people get to put them into their collections. Print time. Okay, back to looking at everyone. So there are a couple of prints here that are made using intaglio processes. What prints look like they might have a plate mark or an area where there's a piece of metal maybe that got put into the paper? Yes, I see most of you have it. It is this one where the image is made with an intaglio plate, and this one where you have the intaglio plate. So which print has a bit of a fuzzier line quality in some parts of it? I notice now that it kind of got crushed on some of them. Yeah, so it's still going to be on this one. In this upper section up here in this little green section, some of you guys will have it where there's going to be a bit of a fuzziness in the lines where we drew and scribbled into that, create that texture and the intensity of the lines going everywhere. Some people might not have that because as you print it, the bird is crushed down because a ton of pressure is going onto the metal plate. So yeah, and then the next one we're asking about is which ones have the very large tonal difference in it, very large like tonality that looks like it's an intentional tonality versus just a tone that's there. Yeah, this one again. So this one has the aquatint here. So you can see if you under a loop, there's a bunch of different little dots that are made by having that ink in those areas. Whereas if you look at this one, all that background texture and color, that's just plate tone because there's a bunch of ink left over on the metal plate. And I wanted to talk about this one a little bit more. Plate tone and letterpress and intaglio letterpress is a very big combination you'll see in historical documents, especially in like newspapers and so forth, as I mentioned earlier, because they used to make something on the letterpress, they print your newspaper, and they have like 1 or 2 etchings that you'd put and you'd print with it or afterwards. Paul Revere's famous etching that he made for the Boston newspaper at the time, which had this the image of the Boston Massacre on it. That was an etching that was printed with a letterpress printed newsprint paper. Okay, next we're going to move on is to the planographic kinds of printmaking. And this really means everything that's made on a plane and not as a matrix. So planographic processes, the ink will be laying on top of the fiber, and you can create the illusion of density or texture or color by how much ink is in one spot, but it doesn't build up in height or in distance. It's all on the same layer. So it's a very low contrast ink. We're going to start with a look at lithography. So lithography was developed in 1796 by Alois Senefelder, and then he also later invented color lithography in about 1818. Chromolithography was invented shortly thereafter, which was used, it's kind of the same as color lithography, but it was specifically being referenced to the reproduction of paintings and drawings that other people had already made. In about 1875, offset lithography was invented, and then it was mostly being printed onto metals and other things that were being mass produced. And then in 1905, they realized you could use offset printing on paper. In the 1930s, offset replaced chromolithography because chromolithography required a bunch of hand making of stones. And then offset was just like, we can just do a 4-color process to do all of that instead. In the 1940s, phototypesetting and flexography kind of replaced, but still was a part of photolithography. That was very, very popular. And then that also led to the 1950s, where offset replaced letterpress printing as the largest commercial kind of endeavor. And so once again, we're gonna have another video, this one about lithography. So please read along. Cool. Okay, now as you all saw in the video, lithography is mainly done on either stone or it can be done on aluminum plates. Stone lithography is what I primarily work with, so that's what I had a video for. Anyway, so it involves the use of making a grease depositing pencil or material onto a receptive stone. And you can also do this if you're doing plate lithography, have that be drawn marks that are then photo exposed onto a photo emulsion coated piece of metal. There are two, as I said, there are two main versions of it. You have traditional stone or plate lithography and offset lithography. Traditional lithography is the direct printing from a lithographic substrate like a stone to the piece of paper that you want to have finished, whereas offset is printing from that stone or plate to a rubber blanket, and then from that blanket onto a piece of paper. Most versions of commercial lithography you see are offset. Fine art offset lithography is something that's still done today. Those are usually done just the same as traditional, a larger volume usually. Because it's done by hand and you're making your own films or you're drawing on your own stone, you won't really see color separation. You'll see just of the colors. You'll see large swaths of like your blues or your yellows, but you won't see things like the CMYK color rosettes, which I'll talk about next. Because in commercial offset, that's almost everything else that you'll find printed today. Your modern newspaper, your modern printed books, your magazines, all of that is printed offset for the most part to use it. And if you look at any of those under a microscope, you'll see that they have these things that are rosettes or halftone color separations that are very smooth, usually on a coated piece of paper. But that's a little gradation breakdown you can just see of on the left hand, it's about like a 10 to 30 magnification zoom up to a 50, or just you have these little dots, circles, and things appearing because of how the ink is being applied to the surface of the paper. The next major planographic one is silkscreen or screen printing, which involves using a screen that gets coated with a photo emulsion, and then an image or ink is dragged over it and through it. We're going to have a short video about that later. First is the brief timeline of silkscreen, where it was invented, we believe, sometime during the Song Dynasty, so anywhere from that 960 to 1280. It was invented for use on fabrics. And then in the late 1700s, it was introduced into the West, once again, still for fabrics. And then sometime in the early 1900s, someone decided to do it on paper. And then as soon as they realized they could print onto paper, people started figuring out you could do photochemical stuff, like how they're doing with photographs and intaglio work, but on the stenciling material, on the very fine silk screens. And that became a medium that you would see popping up in commercial practices. In the 1930s, serigraphy was coined after an artist group formed together to try and elevate it into art. And in the 1950s, you have pop art movement. The pop art movement kind of popularized screen printing as a wide kind of print art form that would take on its own life. And then in the 1970s and 80s, you have water-based acrylic inks, which are being developed, which introduces silkscreen printing to a huge audience of schools, of people at their homes doing it for fun. And that really is what blew up and became the huge acrylic and screen printing world that we know today. And so here is a brief silkscreen process video. Please follow along as well. Screen printing is really popular because of its wide array of uses today, from printing on fabrics and t-shirts to printing on signs or sides of buildings. So it's a very, very common one that you'll see everywhere. Alrighty. So screen prints, silkscreens, or serigraphs can combine photographic elements, flat graphic elements, hand-drawn elements, tons of different things because you're just pushing the ink through the screen. So on the right-hand side, you can see it's a really close-up detail of what a silkscreen looks like. You have the dozens or hundreds upon thousands of interlocking pieces of silk or plastic, whatever the material in the mesh is made out of. And then you have that hardened layer of emulsion, the plasticky, light sensitive, water soluble thing that once it gets exposed to light, it becomes very hard and it's no longer soluble. And that's really what will create the mask that you have. Another part of silkscreen is using it for stenciling or profile or things of that nature. This is also one of the more common types of printing that was done beforehand. You could use this a lot with stuff like freezer paper or contact paper on an actual stencil. You didn't need to have it be a photo emulsion. Matisse actually found one of the most famous people to use this as a fine art technique for his series that he made, which includes that piece on the right, Jazz. The next type of these are going to be monoprints and monotypes. Monoprints refer to any impression that was pulled a single time and was not reproduced, usually from a matrix or something, so it could be recreated. And a monotype is a print that can physically not be reproduced because of how it was made. So when you see on the left, you have a monoprint, you have those matrices that are those two bears forms, and I think there's silkscreen for the targets, versus a monotype on the right, which was a drop of water onto a piece of ink that was then pulled. So print at time. We have two examples here. Technically we have three because we also have monotypes. Of one of a lithograph, one of a silkscreen, and a monotype. So what print looks like it has a thick layer of ink, like a very thick layer of ink? Everyone, let's see, people. Yeah. So we're going to have two answers for this one actually because of the materials that were being used. I see some people have both of them correct. The thickest layers of ink you'll see are the screen print, and everyone has their own little monotype. Monotypes you'll get, they vary a little bit because of how the ink was applied. But the silkscreen, if you look at the actual like parts down here where there's this large clear area, it's a very large, very thick layer of ink that's on top of the paper. It doesn't get pressed into it. It's just sitting on top of the paper. Also, silkscreens are noticeable and very memorable because you can put text in it very easily. You don't have to do any, when you have it as a digital output or digital screen or digital film, the text can just be typed into your computer and then you can print out a film for it. So a lot of screen prints will have text. No, go backwards. Which print looks like it is a flat handmade drawing? Yeah, it's little geese or ducks, birds. That's the one. This is a stone lithograph. As you saw in the video, you have to hand draw on the stone itself to get kind of a texture and detail. You can also make it with films that you make. But when you do it with films, it'll look a little bit flatter even than that. So if you look underneath a microscope at this print, you'll notice that the actual, like the darkest areas down here and the lightest areas up here are the same like height. They're not more or less. It's just the density of which that area and the density of that ink around it is greater and less. Whereas if it was like an intaglio drawing, the intaglio print would have a very, very, very thick, heavy area of ink, and it'd be pretty dimensional, and this would have nothing. That's one way you can identify an intaglio print from a lithograph outside of the plate mark. And the last one was, come here. So this is for the monotype one. Which one looks like it might have some freeform splotching or not super, might be from a matrix, one might say. And some people have, everyone has a varying different kind of monotype. Yeah, those are your monotypes. Those are things that are one, you can only do it once really. You can't really do it again because it was done by having ink that was kind of painted onto a surface that was then printed, as opposed to like onto a matrix or something. So the next section are digital and electric prints. Oh, go right to that. And this is really something that's been around for as long as computers have been around, and even before then in general too, in some cases. So digital electric prints, the electrophotographic, so toner and laser prints, they use a very thin layer of dry or wet toner that gets melted onto the paper. So like photocopies, your Xerox machine, mimeographs if you had those. You have inkjet, which is a series of dots that are sprayed in a random dot pattern that overlap and blend together to create your tonality or your colors. So Epson printers, a lot of large format printers, and sometimes what you have at your house. Thermographic printers, which are using dyed inks, which are heated to the surface. So things like spirit duplicators, photo printing ID badges, some other photo printing stuff, those are thermographic, but they still are digital prints. And then you have this weird others category, which people couldn't really identify or name because it's everything in between. So hybrids, alternate means of reproduction, your indigo electrical ink printers, your risograph, your spirit duplicators, all of that kind of falls into this others category. And I do want to take a note to mention for archivists that the word giclée, which is thrown around a lot in a lot of the printing people and gallerists today, doesn't actually have a definition in the fine art print world, because it's all it talks about is it's a digital print that was made on a sheet of paper. It doesn't tell you anything about that process or what it is. So it's not actually a term that artists or printmakers will use. Next one. Come on. So inkjet versus toner print. So inkjet prints, like you see on the top row, are mostly just a bunch of dots that are sprayed on a random pattern. If you look at the Pug of Jesus, as I call him, it's this guy under a microscope or the loop, you should be able to see that he is indeed done in this manner. They're bands of color dots that are sprayed down as the printer head goes across the paper. Whereas toner laser prints have the same kind of banding that goes across them, but it's very fuzzy in some regards because it's not color pigments being sprayed onto it, it's plastic particles that are being melted to the page. And you will always see that as a parallel band. Whereas sometimes inkjet prints, you won't have them fully parallel because you'll have just sections that are in different segments of the paper. Risograph prints, which are another very popular thing today, are kind of like your spirit duplicators that you used to have. You might find pieces of in your archives if you have any. They're very thin layers of inks that'll overlap, and they're kind of just spun around drums that are stenciled to create any color that you want. And they're very, very popular for contemporary zines and contemporary artist books. And so for the last little print ID time, I believe, we have a couple of them. So which print do you see has banding when you look under a microscope? Everyone. So it might be a bit hard to tell because banding and that kind of, it does take a bit of a high magnification. So if some of you might have a 10 or a 30 magnification lens, it might not be as easy to tell, but usually it'll be this one right here, this little guy. And you should see it somewhat in this one too. Because this is an inkjet print, this is a laser print. And so colored dots. The next question I had is which one has colored dots that are next to each other? You all might have them in various parts, but you all have different versions. So like magazine clippings, it's the offset prints that you get from any sort of digital or mass-produced piece of media. Look at it underneath a microscope or a lens. You'll see there's just very tiny little rosettes. If you have the digital file, you can actually zoom in on the digital file and you'll see the rosettes in it. I noticed that when I was playing it the other day. No, go backwards. And yeah, the next question that I had was, which ones are on a coated paper? This is how you identify commercial prints primarily from traditional prints. Coated papers are very slick and smooth. That's to help with high quality and high output of like the commercial offset printer or a Canon, a laser printer. So this one and this one are very, very smooth papers. You also can sometimes get this one, or things which have this on the back of it, the little pink dots. Those prints, these are all risograph prints. They're very similar to like the silkscreen or litho print, but they're done digitally. So they're going to have, some people will have the rosette pattern on them. Some people will have just solid swaths of color. It's one of the weird ones that you can identify because it is this weird mix of the two. Okay, next one. Next thing we'll talk about is the secondary processes. How much of my time looking? The secondary processes are used on prints to enhance or to bolster the colors that are already there. So you can see on this example, the photo. Oh, sorry. Did someone? The last print I talked about was a risograph print. You all have different ones as well because they came from a book. But that is, I showed it previously. If I can get back to it. It's this one here, Heather. So see how there's those drums in the lower left corner? Those drums are color, and then the actual printing machine will create a stencil mask over the drum, and it'll push the liquid out through that stencil mask for the drum, which is why it's kind of a weird mix between like silkscreen, lithography, and digital printing. Anyways, so yeah, this one you have secondary processes. So the first of them is hand embellishing. You might come across a lot of these if you have older materials in your archive or in general. Things like watercolor, hand drawing on top of it, cutting out of things. So, and then also you might have hand embroidery, depending on what kind of prints you have. It's a huge range, anything that's done by hand. Oh, come on, go next. The next big one is chincollate, which is the process of adhering a piece of thin paper or tissue paper while you print underneath the printing surface. So that way you'll have like a piece of Japanese paper or Japanese tissue paper on your print that's underneath all the printing, but on top of the paper. So you can see it here as the examples. You have two different kinds of decorative, I can get this again. Two different kinds of tissues that were printed underneath. And they also have it like up here, you have some more chincollate images and chincollate sections. And then also this large swath underneath here was also a chincollate piece from her. Okay, let's stop that. The next one is dusting. So it's the process of adhering a layer of metallic or colored plastic particles to a print. So you can see kind of here, there are these little speckles that will reflect light. You print that, you print like a layer of ink or of pigment, and then you put the particles on top of it. They can just, different kinds of particles, the metal versus plastic, will require different kinds of adhesives, from glue to ink. Gilding also is another process that you're going to see a lot of in older prints, particularly in religious iconography and religious prints. It's very popular there. Or it's just you're taking gold leaf and you're applying it over an ink or a glue onto the sheet of paper that you're printing. Typically, you apply it over a red ink. That's just how it's done traditionally, but people buck that all the time and do whatever they want. So not always red ink. And the last one I'm going to talk about, this I believe, is flocking, which is you're adding fabric or a synthetic material to a layer of ink or adhesive to give that velvet texture. You might remember there was that big trend in the 90s of those like velvety prints and velvety like drawing things people could have for their kids. Those were flocked prints, where you had a large offset piece of paper that was printed with a thing, and then velvet or crushed fibers were placed on top of the layer of glue to create that texture. And then the last tiny little bit we're talking about are going to be chops and printer stamps. So chops are something you can use. You'll find on a lot of like the fine art prints. They'll tell you who made the print, and it can usually tell you what's made or what it's made out of if you know who made them. Because most shops will have a specialty. And the same thing can be said for publishers and printer stamps. They're very common, it's mostly in Asian and Eastern works. And you can also will find them on the backs of bleed prints because it won't distort the image on the front. And they will serve the same function as a chop, but they also can serve as like an approval process, like a printer seal or a publisher seal or a censor seal saying it was good to go. Watermarks can be found on the inside of paper. It's something that comes in during the papermaking process. So you can use watermarks to identify a lot of different kinds of papers or their ages or things like that. Watermark identification in books and on paper is a really, really good way of checking out and making sure that papers and books are to what age we think that they are, or making sure that they're the right ones or where they're from, because different paper mills will have different paper watermarks and stuff like that. In modern art today, you can use them even as a part of the paper, the part of the work that you're making, even just like a remark to the actual image. Okay. And so the last one I was going to do is, which prints have like a glittering area of ink that you see? Come on. Yes. So this guy, this sun, it's dusted with gold dusting powder. So something you'll see that'll happen every so often in like your archives for religious iconography. There's a word, I'm saying it wrong. I'm sorry. You'll see a lot of things that are golden. If they can't afford real gold leaf, they'll be doing it with crushed gilding like this. And which one has another embellishment? It might be something about like hand embellishing, like watercolors. Yes. So the one with watercolors is actually going to be this one. The watercolors you'll see are all the green and the little gold. I believe I saw someone had one of the monotypes up. The monotype actually isn't a hand embellished one. Those are made by just painting. So it could look like that, and I can understand why you think it was, but it's actually just the monotype. Because it's pigment that's suspended in like a solvent that gets printed, as opposed to being hand painted on top of the print afterwards. The next big thing we're going to talk about, so that's also the actual identification of prints. We're going to talk about condition issues and how to work with something. So the inadequate storage of prints can result in a couple of big things. Tears, creases, rolling of prints, discoloration, matte burn, and just general overcrowded storage spaces. Okay, come on. So overcrowded storage containers. Usually it's like you have too small of a box, or there's too many things in the box, or just the wrong kind of storage container for what you're trying to store. It's never really a good thing to have that kind of stuff, just because it might lead to damage. Things like tears, creases, or rolls, which is caused by those like the box or just improper handling. So if something's stored without support, it might want to bend or just flex. If it's stored upright, it might want to fall down into a sleeve or fall down into an area and just take on a perpetual J-bend. And even if you hold the paper in a way that doesn't like to be held, it might get a divot and a crease in it. You can see these two examples. One is a tear from improper handling, and one is a crease and bend just from being crammed into a box in the wrong space, or an overcrowded box, honestly. So other things, for safe handling of paper objects. When you're moving paper, you should hold it by two opposite diagonal corners. This is for at least for large paper. And let the paper move. You don't want to force it. Because if you force the paper, it might develop a crease or crescent. Don't let paper come in contact with the surface at an angle. If you don't put a paper down flat, the angle that you put it down in, if you put it down and like, whoa, that was not what I wanted to do. Example here. If you put the paper onto a surface like this, that has a risk of actually creating a divot right here where the paper is flexing. And that can create imperfections and damage to your object. If possible, you should always have your paper supported by something like a rigid backing board or any other sort of rigid support. I hope it's back underneath something else. But an example is going to be like this right now, just rigid support, print on top of it, hold it. Blue board, other objects, things that are going to support it so it doesn't actually want to flex on its own is what you're going to want. Another thing you're going to find is discoloration from bad storage. That's caused by materials that are acidic or that are becoming acidic over time, or they're overexposed to light. Common things to look out for, you have like Xerox paper, some tissue papers, gummed papers, foam core, glassine, weird plastics like shrink wrapping, tape, any kind of tape, wood, mat board, and chipboard are all pretty acidic and will cause damage or discoloration to your print or to your objects over time. Mat burn in particular is one really well-known thing. It's caused by like acidic window mats or acidic materials that are in contact with an object. Just so you guys know, like all mats made prior to 1980 will gonna cause this kind of damage because they're all very acidic. And a lot of decorative mats that are in use today, like colored mats or things of that nature that are not approved for conservation use, but they don't tell you they aren't, will probably cause this area this kind of damage. If you look in the photo 10, so all of this large tonality area, so you can see all of this, where this kind of points to, all of this is where a mat was in contact with the piece of paper. And so it was very, very, very matte burned when it came in. And so then the other part you'll have is this line you'll see around here, which is where the edge of the window mat was. And that's where there was pressure pointing and pressing down onto the object itself. And that is going to cause a little bit more of a matte burn because there's pressure more in contact, not just in the broad contact with it. And that's all, sorry, Will. Heather, I'll get to you that question in just a moment. The next thing is going to be foxing, which is a natural process that happens in paper. It's usually the reddish brown discoloration. It's a result of impurities in the paper when it was made, so either in the water or in the mold, the actual presence of it. Sorry, it's mold or impurities, sorry. Yeah, I need my water. Foxing can spread between adjacent sheets in like a book or in your portfolios or flat files or your archives. It's not actually harmful to your paper or to your objects. It just is aesthetically displeasing, but it isn't actually damaging or harmful. But it is something that you will see a lot of, especially in older documents and older volumes. There is a way to remove foxing, but it actually it involves kind of bleaching the paper, and it's something that you do, you have a conservator do it for you, just because it is very easy to damage and destroy the object in accident if you're trying to remove it yourself. Mitigation practices. So the best practices are just to store your materials in a pH neutral or alkaline buffered enclosure. If you can, store them with pH neutral interleaving, stuff that's either lignin free like leading-free paper, polyester films, like Mylars, or something that passes something called the PAT, the photo activity test, for stuff like microchamber paper. If possible, you should store paper, documents, or flat objects flat. That way they're not wanting to bend or slip down or things like that. And do not overcrowd the box. Another big thing here is that what's safe for printed documents and other archival materials is not always going to be safe for photographic materials. So things like glass negatives or daguerreotypes or those first iterations of those photographs that you got from Rite Aid for the 1 hour photo thing. Those kinds of photographs and photo things are not great. They're not ideally stored in boxes that are ideal for paper. Usually you want to have those kind of photographs stored in much colder environments with different kinds of materials or boards. And here just as a selection of archival materials before and after they've been rehoused. This is from the Sicilian archive, so it's a nice little example of, on the left you have really acidic board and acidic boxes with kind of just haphazard folders that are not the right size for the box. And then on the right, you have dividers that are the right size for the box, so everything's separated out so it's in nice condition and everything is in an equal space. And you also will remove stuff like staples and paper clips that might cause more damage. Some great resources for people who are looking or interested in trying to learn more about print identification. Graphic Atlas, put forth by the IPI, the Image Permanence Institute, is a great resource to look at for identifying different print processes as well as photographic processes. The IFPDA, the International Fine Print Dealers Association, has a great little resource page talking about different kinds of prints and what they are. The Met Museum had a really, really big overview of printed practice and what different print medias are. As an example there. MoMA has a little printed brochure. They used to have a website that was interactive that you could do to learn more about it. But since I believe Chrome or other websites stopped using the interactive Flash programs that you could use, it's kind of gone out and no longer is usable. Some books that I found that were really helpful are The Digital Print, Identification and Preservation, which was published by the Getty Conservation Institute in 2009. Talks all about the different kinds of digital and photographic prints that are created today. Stuff from risograph, silkscreen, offset, indigos. There's a huge range of digital printing technology I didn't talk about that they cover. The book Hard Pressed, 600 Years of Print and Process by David Platzker and Elizabeth Wyckoff is also really good. And it's also another really good overview on printing. The same thing said for the print in the Western world, an introductory history, and prints and printmaking, an introduction to the history of techniques. Come on. Here's a print bibliography of all the things that you saw today. If you have something that you liked or want to look more about, let me know. I can send you to the artist's information. And next, come on. Do we have any questions? I believe everyone has been unmuted, or I don't know if people are unmuted. I do not see that. But if people have any questions, please raise their hand and I will try and get to you and we'll look at that. Oh, Heather, recommendations for interleaving for prints. I mentioned it briefly, but things like Mylar or polyester film, unbuffered tissue paper, things that are alkaline or that are non-acidic or what you really want. Glassine acidifies over time and becomes very brittle. That's why I kind of always caution against it. Okay.
Can you just go over these, which processes these are? This is a letterpress and this is some kind of engraving, but I'm just trying to label them so I have future reference.
So the top one is letterpress, you were correct. That's lead type. And the lower section is actually an etching.
And this one?
That is a bunch. That is aquatint, which is that tonal, the big tonal area is the aquatint. Most of the line work is etching. And then you have, I don't know if yours has the fuzzy parts up here, but it's got dry point up here in this arc. I cannot, you have to use your magnifying glass to look at it.
Oh, I see.
If it's got some fuzziness to it, it's got dry point in it. Not all of them, because of how etching works and the process of printing, the burr got crushed. So it got crushed down, so you can't get the burr anymore on some of them. And then you also have hand embellishment because of the watercolors.
Thank you.
Any other questions? ID-wise, housing-wise? Sure.
So what would you recommend for someone who wants to keep the, like a glassine enclosure as part of, you know, an artist's book's artifact? Like, would you do it separately, or what would be your suggestions for that?
So if the glassine is important to the actual book, like it's actually a part of it. If it's not, I would replace it.
But they want it.
They want the glassine there. Okay.
Yeah, your curator wants it.
That unfortunately, I believe, might actually be a curatorial question. I asked other concerts and scientists to just kind of lend in like, hey, we know this gets brittle and acidifies. It can break if we keep it with the object, and it might cause more damage to the object. We can keep it on the side with the object or associated with the object and replace it with like actual mylar interleaving or things that are non-acidic that'll be better for the longevity of the print.
Okay, thanks. That's kind of what my feeling was also, but I just didn't get another opinion.
No problem. Anything else housing-wise or print ID-wise I can help with? Other print practices or processes that you have questions about that I didn't cover? There's a huge range of them, and I can only talk about so many.
There's a few more questions in the chat box. Sorry.
Sure. Oh, let me see the chat box. Chat box? More. Aha, there we go. So, you are Sarah? Or sorry, I can't see names on this one. I'm just gonna go down the list. I see Gil Ramos. I did just address that. Glassine is not the best for long-term storage. It does get brittle and acidify over time. Sarah, could you say to leave prints in flat files instead of activable mats, similar sizes and stacked, or better to remove them and add interleaving? If the mats, for Sarah's question, if the mats are all the same size, or at least relative size, and the prints and objects are not being forced down or touching the windows and openings of the other pieces that you see, that should be fine. I still recommend if you can open the mat, like if it's still hinged, you can have the part in, it still opens a bit. If you want to put some glassine or some mylar or something, an interleaving sheet in between them temporarily, that way the mat, if it does fall through, it doesn't actually damage the surface. We tend to use like a sheet of Polytex. I don't know if you have that, but it's like a very nice thin polyester bond, polyester spun woven polyester kind of thing. That's very great interleaving. That's what we use at the center. But we also are not, that's something we just do in-house. Once it goes out to the client, then that goes to wherever they want to store it. Or you can have a storage mat if you have that possibility, where you have like a piece of mat board that goes on top of the actual opening to create a protective layer around it so you don't have something falling into something else. Amy's question, portfolio prints, glassine should be replaced. I would probably replace them when I can, as early as possible for Amy Adelfer. But that once again is a question on if you have the ability to do so faster or not. If it's starting to discolor and become brittle, I would definitely replace it at that point, just because that means that it's actively becoming harmful. But in that first, we have a couple of years, I think. It's not immediate, really. Glassine doesn't discolor and acidify super quickly, but it does over time. But you can definitely replace it as you can. what to use for backing boards? We use corrugated alkali blue board if possible. Stephanie just put it in the chat. It's a nice double-walled corrugated blue board. It's alkali buffered, and it is very strong and sturdy. I quite like it. Anything else? Any other questions people have? Anything else I can answer print-wise?
I've got another one.
Oh, sure.
So if you, when moving large prints, let's say from, a flat file storage system to, whatever, a different room in an institution or something like that. What, for oversized materials, what are your suggestions for traveling with them safely?
Sure. If you are able to do that and have it in like a large something on a backing board or a support, I would definitely put it onto like if you have a moving cart you can use to travel around with. Maybe put the print onto the backing board onto the cart. That way it's always supported while it's in transit. If the print is too large to fit through your doors, you can keep it to the backing board, kind of like hold it briefly, and then you can kind of tilt it and go through, but tilt as little as possible because you don't want it to fall off. And then once you're at the door, back flat again onto the cart, keep rolling. Some people, I don't know if you have the ability to make folders, very large folders with like a big piece of like 20-point alkaline board, buffer board, kind of. If I can get this material. Kind of like this stuff, this alkali buffered board. If you can make that a folder from this and blue board underneath it, you could kind of hold it up kind of vertically and let the blue board and the crease edge keep it in so it won't fall out just in case while you hold it and keep everything in place.
Thank you. It's always awkward to like, okay, how do we get it someplace?
No, I understand. We have some very large objects at the center as well, which always kind of make us question how we move them around.
Yeah, thank you.
It's doable, definitely doable. Any other questions? Well, I think it's just about time for this webinar to be over then. Thank you so much for everyone for attending. Please enjoy your prints. Also, if you have any questions, you can just give me an email. My email is biluzada@ccaha.org, or you can reach me at the center's phone number, extension 307. Well, have a great day, everybody.